I was told to sign the resignation letter or be terminated immediately. Those were the exact words, delivered without emotion, without hesitation, and without even the courtesy of pretending this was difficult for them. And after 21 years of loyal service, I was given exactly 30 minutes to decide my future, so I chose resignation, but I wrote my own version because I understood something they did not. Power in corporate environments rarely belongs to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the person who understands the rules better than everyone else. And 5 days later, when their corporate attorney called me at precisely 7:43 a.m., his voice tight, clipped, and controlled in the way only lawyers sound when panic is bleeding through professionalism, asking if we could clarify the precise language. In my resignation letter, I knew that the sentence I had written had done exactly what I intended it to do, but to understand why that one sentence mattered, you need to understand who I was to that company, what they thought they were getting rid of, and how badly they underestimated the cost of treating a long-serving employee as disposable. My name is Anna Vaughn. I was 46 years old at the time this happened, and for more than 2 decades I worked at Ascent Systems, a Denver-based enterprise software firm specializing in ERP solutions for large manufacturing clients, a company I joined in July of 2004 as a junior operations analyst fresh out of graduate school with an MBA, earning $42,000 a year, living in a studio apartment that took half my paycheck, driving a second-hand car, and working late nights not because anyone demanded it but because I believed loyalty and excellence still meant something. And over the next 21 years I moved steadily upward, role by role, promotion by promotion, until I became Senior Director of Global Operations, overseeing 41 employees across North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia, managing vendor relationships, compliance frameworks, operational continuity, and risk mitigation for contracts that generated $63 million annually, earning $192,000 plus bonuses, benefits, and a portfolio of stock options accumulated under multiple long-term incentive plans. But more than my title or compensation, I was the institutional memory of the organization, the person executives quietly relied on when they needed to understand why a legacy contract was structured the way it was, why a particular client had special pricing, why certain systems couldn't simply be sunset without catastrophic downstream consequences. And I knew every one of those details because I had been there when they were created, when they were negotiated, when they were patched together during crises no one else remembered anymore. And that made me valuable in ways spreadsheets couldn't capture until February of 2025, when Ascents was acquired by Dominion Corporate Holdings, an $11 billion conglomerate with a reputation for aggressive cost optimization, a polite term for buying companies, stripping them down, and extracting short-term value regardless of long-term damage. And the acquisition was announced with all the usual reassurances about stability, continuity, and exciting new opportunities. But I had watched enough of these takeovers in my career to know exactly what was coming, because within a week the new leadership team arrived, a 35-year-old CEO whose background was entirely in venture capital, a 33-year-old CFO who spoke almost exclusively in ratios and cost curves, and a coterie of consultants who viewed experience not as an asset but as an inefficiency. And that very first night after the announcement, I went home, opened my laptop, updated my resume, and then did something else that would later matter far more. I began documenting everything, every email, every meeting, every shift in responsibility, every offhand comment about legacy employees and right-sizing compensation, saving copies in 3 encrypted backups, because I understood that when companies plan to remove people quietly, the paper trail becomes the battlefield. By March, the pattern was unmistakable. Employees over 40 were being laid off or pressured out. Anyone earning over $115,000 was suddenly under performance review, and the language in leadership meetings shifted from collaboration to elimination. And by April, the target moved squarely onto me, with meetings disappearing from my calendar, key decisions reassigned to managers nearly 20 years younger than me, public questioning of my competence in forums where my past successes had once been praised, all classic pressure tactics designed to make an employee quit voluntarily. But I didn't, because my performance record was flawless. My evaluations were exemplary, and I had nothing to be ashamed of. So they escalated again, and on June 27th, the CFO invited me into his office and presented what he described as a strategic realignment of my role, which translated to the same responsibilities under a downgraded title with a salary of $94,000, a $98,000 pay cut, which any employment attorney would immediately recognize as constructive dismissal, and mine did, advising me not to accept and to let the company make the next move. And that move came on August 4th at 3:15 p.m. when I was summoned to conference room C, where 4 executives sat waiting with a resignation letter already printed, already dated, already framed as a voluntary decision on my part, and they gave me 2 options: resign and receive 3 weeks of severance, or be terminated for organizational restructuring. With nothing, and as I read the document, I saw exactly what it was designed to do: waive all legal claims, erase my tenure, sever my rights under change of control provisions, and close the door behind me quietly. But instead of arguing, instead of raising my voice, instead of pleading, I looked up and said calmly that I would resign, and the relief in the room was immediate and visible, because they thought the problem had solved itself, until I added one condition: I would write my own resignation letter, and after a brief hesitation they agreed, because they assumed a resignation was resignation, and they did not take the time to read the sentence I wrote. A single sentence that stated my resignation would be effective only upon receipt of complete settlement of all compensation, bonuses, stock options, severance, and benefits owed under my employment agreement, and applicable law language precise enough to satisfy statutory requirements, broad enough to encompass every obligation they owed me, and conditional enough to delay my departure indefinitely until those obligations were fulfilled. And they accepted it, thanked me, escorted me out, and locked my system access before the end of the day, celebrating what they believed was a clean exit, until 5 days later, when their legal team realized the problem. I had not resigned yet. I was still technically employed, still accruing salary and benefits, still entitled to vesting under change of control clauses triggered by the acquisition, and still holding documented evidence of age discrimination and constructive dismissal that exposed them to significant liability, and that realization triggered a cascade of increasingly frantic communications, starting with the early morning call from their attorney, followed by settlement offers that grew larger as their exposure became clearer. Because my documentation was exhaustive, my contract terms were unambiguous, and every delay increased the amount they owed me, until finally, after weeks of negotiation, they agreed to settle in full, wiring $1.75 million, issuing a formal letter of recommendation praising my contributions, and acknowledging my resignation effective only after settlement. And by the time it was over, several of the executives who had orchestrated my removal were themselves quietly dismissed, casualties of the same system they thought they controlled, while I walked away financially secure, semi-retired at 46, now consulting independently and teaching others how to protect themselves, because the lesson here isn't about revenge or bitterness. It's about understanding leverage, knowing your rights, documenting everything, and remembering that in environments built on power and hierarchy, the person who reads the fine print often has the final word. The settlement didn't end the story. It exposed everything that had been happening behind closed doors, because once the money was wired and the paperwork finalized, the silence that followed was louder than any confrontation, and in that quiet I began to understand just how close they had come to destroying not only my career but the operational stability of the company itself, since in their rush to eliminate me, they had ignored the intricate web of dependencies I managed. And within weeks of my departure, cracks began to show, first subtly and then all at once, as missed deadlines, triggered penalty clauses in long-standing contracts, Regional managers struggled to interpret legacy processes I had built and maintained, and vendors began escalating issues that no one else knew how to resolve because the documentation they thought existed lived mostly in my head, refined by years of experience and judgment that cannot be transferred through a handover memo. And while I was no longer obligated to intervene, I watched from a distance as former colleagues reached out privately, asking for guidance they were now too embarrassed to request publicly, telling me that meetings had become chaotic, that decisions were being reversed weekly, and that the same executives who once dismissed experience as overhead were now scrambling to recreate it through overpriced consultants who billed hourly for insights I had provided freely for years. Meanwhile, the internal investigation triggered by my legal documentation began unfolding, because when corporate attorneys reviewed my evidence, they uncovered patterns that extended far beyond my case, revealing systematic targeting of older employees, deliberate manipulation of performance reviews, and internal communications that explicitly discussed replacing high earners with cheaper, more flexible talent. Language that became indefensible once placed under legal scrutiny, and as regulators became involved, the company's leadership quietly shifted from confidence to containment, rebranding restructuring decisions as cultural missteps, and attempting damage control while distancing themselves from the very managers they had empowered to execute the cuts. And it was during this period that I realized how fragile corporate authority truly is, because the same executives who had leaned back in their chairs while issuing ultimatums were now constrained by compliance officers, legal counsel, and board oversight, forced to answer questions they could not spin away, while I, free from obligation, chose when and how to respond, consulting selectively, declining invitations that felt opportunistic, and accepting projects on my own terms because the settlement gave me something far more valuable than money. It gave me time, autonomy, and leverage, and with those resources I began rebuilding my professional life deliberately rather than reactively, advising mid-sized firms on operational risk, mentoring senior employees, navigating acquisitions, and teaching them what I had learned the hard way: that loyalty without documentation is vulnerability, that silence in the face of pressure is often mistaken for weakness, and that the most dangerous moment in any corporate career is when leadership believes you have no options, because that assumption leads to mistakes, and mistakes compound quickly when made against someone who understands contracts, timing, and leverage. And as news of the settlement spread quietly through professional networks, not as gossip but as cautionary example, I received messages from people who said my case had changed how they approached their own careers, how they negotiated severance, how they documented interactions, and how they refused to be rushed into decisions designed to benefit only one side. And while I never sought vindication or public recognition, I took a certain satisfaction in knowing that the system that tried to erase me had instead amplified my voice, because the truth is that corporations rarely learn from empathy or fairness. They learn from cost, and my one sentence had cost them far more than keeping me ever would have, and that realization reshaped how I viewed the end of my career at Ascens, not as a loss, but as a transition, a final negotiation in which experience proved its worth one last time. And as I stepped fully into independence, closing that chapter without bitterness, I understood that the real victory wasn't the settlement amount or the executives who were later removed. It was reclaiming control over my time and narrative, proving that even in systems designed to minimize individuals, precision, patience, and preparation can still tilt the balance, and that sometimes the most effective response to being told you are replaceable is to calmly demonstrate, in terms the system understands, exactly how expensive that assumption can be. What surprised me most after everything settled wasn't the money or the freedom. It was how quickly the narrative inside the company began to unravel once the person they tried to silence was no longer constrained by loyalty or fear, because in the months that followed, fragments of the truth surfaced through former colleagues, compliance reviews, and board-level discussions that confirmed something I had suspected all along. My case was never about performance, redundancy, or strategy. It was about optics and cost, and once that reality became impossible to ignore, the organization entered a phase of quiet self-preservation, rewriting internal histories, reassigning blame, and slowly removing the very executives who had championed the purge, not in dramatic firings but through mutual separations and personal departures designed to limit exposure. And as those changes rippled outward, I saw how fragile authority becomes when it is built on intimidation rather than competence, because the managers who replaced me struggled not just with workload but with judgment, unable to anticipate second-order consequences. Missing risks that experience teaches you to see before they materialize, and making decisions that looked efficient on paper but collapsed under real-world complexity. And ironically, it was during this period that I was approached most aggressively to return, not as an employee but as a consultant. Offers that came with high hourly rates, short-term contracts, and carefully worded clauses acknowledging that my expertise was suddenly indispensable again. Offers I declined more often than I accepted, not out of spite, but because I had learned the value of choosing when to engage. And when I did agree, it was on my terms, with clear scope, clear compensation, and clear boundaries, because once you have been pushed out under false pretenses, you never forget how quickly loyalty is weaponized against you. Meanwhile, outside that organization, my experience had begun to shape how others navigated similar situations, as peers reached out not for sympathy but for strategy, asking how to protect themselves during mergers, how to recognize constructive dismissal before it escalates, and how to document behavior without appearing adversarial. And I told them the truth rarely hear in leadership seminars, that corporations are not families, that policies matter more than promises, and that the moment you sense a power imbalance shifting, you must prepare quietly rather than react emotionally, because preparation buys you options, and options change outcomes. Over time, I realized that what I had gained wasn't just a financial settlement or professional independence, but clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of how systems reward compliance until it becomes inconvenient, and how quickly they punish those who assume fairness will protect them. And that clarity informed every decision I made going forward, from how I structured consulting agreements to how I evaluated leadership teams, looking less at charisma and more at how they treated dissent, because organizations reveal their values not in mission statements but in moments of pressure. And as I built a quieter, more intentional life, consulting selectively, mentoring thoughtfully, and declining roles that required sacrificing autonomy, I stopped measuring success by title or salary and started measuring it by control, because control over my time, my work, and my eggs, it was something no employer could ever take from me again. And when I look back now, I don't see a dramatic confrontation or a moment of triumph. I see a series of small, deliberate choices made under pressure, choices that compounded into leverage, leverage into protection, and protection into freedom. And that is the lesson I carry forward. In environments where power is uneven and stakes are high, the calmest person in the room is often the most dangerous, because while others are focused on winning the moment, that person is quietly securing the outcome.